In the humid spring of 1855, when the Mississippi's breath rolled across sugarcane rows and the air inside Louisiana's parish, town seemed permanently heavy with heat and suspicion. The story of a middle-aged Creole matron named Elise Delrue began its slow, quiet rise into local rumor. She was the daughter of a French trader and a free woman of color, and in the tiered social lattice of Antebellum Louisiana where lineage, shade, wealth, and allegiance could twist identities as surely as the river carved its banks lease, occupied a precarious but respected place. She managed a modest two-story home near the outskirts of St. Landry Parish, a house inherited from her mother that had once echoed with children's laughter and visitors' footsteps but had grown noticeably quieter since the death of her husband 2 years earlier. To most, she appeared solitary but decent, known for her precise manners, her unwavering attendance at Mass, and her discreet charity toward poorer families in the region. Yet in 1855, the tides of the country had become restless. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had not merely tightened laws, it had hardened hearts, empowered slave catchers, and made suspicion an everyday weapon. In that climate, even the gentlest acts of mercy could be reinterpreted as crimes against order. Elise's home sat at the edge of a stand of cypress trees, and to those who passed in the early mornings, the sight of smoke curling from her kitchen chimney meant nothing unusual. What they did not know, and what would later become the seat of scandal, was that inside that dim house two boys, both teenagers, both escapees from a nearby plantation, worked by one of the region's most severe overseers, had found a temporary refuge. Their names were whispered only among those who dared to help them: Samuel, aged 16, and Isaac, barely 14. They had fled the plantation not out of youthful rebellion, but from a beating that had nearly taken Samuel's life. Their mother, a field hand hardened by years of endurance, had pleaded for their escape even as she remained trapped by debts, obligations, and the omnipresent threat of being sold further south. The boys had navigated the swampy woods for 2 days before stumbling upon Elise's property. Exhausted, starving, and unable to continue, she had found them slumped beneath her grape arbor, too weak to flee, and something in her face, perhaps a memory of her own sons, lost in infancy, or the fierce empathy of a woman shaped by both privilege and oppression, stayed her impulse to report them. The decision to hide them was not made of recklessness but of quiet conviction, the sort that never announces itself but reveals its strength only in retrospect. She brought them inside at dusk, guiding them toward the attic ladder behind the storage room. The attic itself was cramped, dusty, and lit only by narrow slits where the roof met the outer wall, but it was dry and safe compared to the woods. Over the next days, she carried up small trays of food and water, careful to conceal the clinks of dishes beneath the everyday rhythm of her chores. Samuel's back was laced with welts that had begun to fester, and Elise tended these with the same precision she applied to her embroidery, slow, steady, and without fear, aware that discovery could cost her not only her home but her freedom. For a woman of her status, aiding fugitives did not fall under simple charity. It was a federal crime, one that authorities prosecuted with zeal. The sight of U.S. Marshals in the parish had become so frequent that mothers warned their children to lower their voices when speaking of freedom, as if the word itself had gained the power to summon danger. But the boys' presence did not go entirely unnoticed, even if no one yet understood what they were witnessing. Elise's neighbor, a widower named Matthew Roche, had remarked to another man in town that he'd seen lights in the attic at odd hours, and had heard noises that did not resemble the typical settling of an old house. He was not a cruel man, but he was one who believed fiercely in order and obedience, influenced by the rhetoric of plantation elites who insisted that stability depended on knowing one's place. In a time when fear disguised itself as duty, even ordinary observations could evolve into accusations. Meanwhile, Isaac, the younger of the two boys, struggled with the confinement. He had lived his entire life beneath the open sky of the fields, and the attic's low beams pressed upon him like a physical weight. Elise spoke softly to him each evening, offering reassurance, but the child's fear simmered dangerously close to panic. Every creak of the floorboard sent him trembling. Every passing carriage made him believe the slave catchers had arrived. Outside the walls of Elise's home, the broader world was shifting with tensions that would eventually tear the nation apart. Louisiana was a land where French, Spanish, African, and Caribbean influences intertwined, where free people of color could own property yet still face discrimination, where enslaved families created entire cultural worlds of resistance. Beneath the plantation hierarchy, But by 1855, the growing national debate over slavery had turned this hybrid society into a battleground of loyalties. Newspapers printed stories of abolitionists hiding runaways in the North, and Southern legislatures responded with stricter patrols and harsher punishments. Plantation owners in St. Landry Parish had recently complained about a string of nighttime disturbances, tools misplaced, livestock freed, footprints near the cane rows. Some suspected these acts were part of a coordinated resistance among enslaved people. Others blamed poor whites or roaming youths. The truth was far more complex, but in an environment of paranoia, nuance rarely survived. When Samuel and Isaac vanished from the plantation, the overseer blamed abolitionist meddling rather than acknowledging the cruelty that had driven them away. He sent riders toward every direction of the compass, armed with descriptions of the escaped boys and eager to make examples of them. In this tightening net of fear and authority, Elisa's house became a fragile sanctuary. She kept the shutters drawn and avoided receiving visitors, though her absence from social gatherings soon sparked its own quiet commentary. The local seamstress noted she hadn't delivered cloth to Elise in weeks. The parish priest mentioned she seemed distracted, fumbled with her rosary beads, and jumped at distant noises during Mass. Even the butcher remarked she was purchasing more food than usual, though she lived alone. These were small observations, each insignificant by itself, yet together they formed a pattern visible to any community primed for suspicion. Rumors, once ignited, spread not like wildfire, but like slow-burning embers, unseen until they reached dry timber. For the boys hidden above her ceiling, time became measurable only in her footsteps, the rhythm of her voice drifting up the ladder, and the creak of the roof expanding under the sun. Samuel regained strength, but grew restless. Isaac clung to her presence like a lifeline. She told them nothing of the risks she faced, nor of the growing watchfulness around her, choosing instead to shield them from knowledge they could do nothing to change. One afternoon, as marshals passed through the parish asking questions about the missing youths, Elise quietly locked her doors and sat at her kitchen table, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles blanched. She wondered whether compassion itself had become a kind of rebellion. In this era, resistance carried not by armed uprising, but by steady acts of humanity. Memories of her mother's lessons returned to her then, that one should never abandon a child in danger, no matter the cost, because God saw courage even when the world only saw defiance. Her mother, who had lived through the complicated freedoms and oppressions of early 19th century Louisiana, had always insisted that survival required both boldness and discretion. Elise had inherited both qualities, though she had rarely needed to exercise them until now. She heard Isaac coughing through the floorboards and felt a tightening in her chest. There were limits to how long she could keep them hidden, especially with patrols expanding and neighbors whispering. Yet the alternative of returning them to the plantation was unthinkable. The story that began circulating in the parish tavern was simple. A reclusive Creole matron was hiding someone in her house. No one yet said fugitive boys. No one dared imply open defiance of federal law. But in a community attuned to hierarchy, any secret was considered dangerous. Matthew Roche, increasingly convinced he had witnessed more than he first assumed, mentioned his suspicions to a visiting deputy who took the comment seriously enough to record it. The deputy knew the political climate well. Capturing runaways or those suspected of aiding them was a proven means of advancing one's career. In these rural areas, ambition often wore the mask of law enforcement. Without issuing accusations, he began passing by her property at dusk, watching for silhouettes against the attic windows. Elise, perceptive enough to notice, moved the boys deeper into the attic shadows and shuttered the openings with cloth to block any sign of life. The attic became stifling in the midday heat, but it was safer that way. For weeks, this tense balance held. Samuel regained strength and whispered with urgency that they needed to move on. That staying would only endanger her. Isaac protested softly, torn between fear of recapture and fear of the perilous journey ahead. Elise contemplated each possibility in private, weighing moral duty against the survival instincts of someone who understood the unspoken boundaries society imposed on women like her. Free people of color in Louisiana walked a narrow edge. They could own homes, travel with passes, and conduct business. Yet they were always one accusation away from losing everything. Even the suggestion that she had aided fugitives could invite retaliation, legal or otherwise. The plantation hierarchy did not forgive disobedience, especially from those they expected to remain compliant. Still, Elise felt a deep resolve that surprised her. She had lived through grief, through the quiet isolation of widowhood, and through the subtle humiliations imposed on her by a society that granted her partial respect, but not true belonging. Perhaps compassion for these boys filled the void left by those losses. Perhaps it reminded her that she was still capable of shaping her own moral path, in a world determined to confine her dot as the oppressive summer approached. Tension in St. Landry Parish rose further. A plantation owner claimed that abolitionist pamphlets had been found near his fields, an accusation likely exaggerated, yet enough to justify increasing patrols and harassing free people of color. Deputies knocked on doors, inspected travel papers, and demanded explanations for the movements of individuals who had once been left alone. Elise knew the radius of danger around her house was shrinking. She planned to send the boys north toward Opelousas, where a loose network of free black families occasionally helped runaways reach safer routes, leading farther west or toward the Red River. But each day she hesitated, fearful that travel would expose them. The attic, stifling though it had become, remained the only safe harbor she could offer, and she clung to the fragile control she still possessed. The moment that would alter everything came quietly, without drama, on a humid evening when the sun was sinking behind the moss-draped trees. Matthew Roche, carrying a lantern, claimed he saw a movement behind Elise's upstairs shutters, movement that looked like a young figure, leaning toward the crack of daylight. Whether he truly saw Samuel or Isaac, or whether his mind filled the shadows with assumptions born of weeks of speculation, no one would ever know. But with that sighting, real or imagined, the suspicion solidified into certainty in his mind. The following morning, he reported what he had seen to the deputy, who wasted no time in relaying the information to marshals already scouring the region. It was enough to justify action, enough to bring authority to her doorstep. And without realizing it, Elise woke that morning unaware that her fragile sanctuary was slipping beyond her control, that the boys in her attic whom she had nursed, fed, protected, and guarded with a mother's instinct were now at the center of a storm she could no longer hold off. The morning after Matthew Roche delivered his quiet accusation, the parish seemed to shift in ways Elise could not yet name. The usual sounds of mules along the road, the rustle of cane fields in the wind, even the murmur of church bells carried a slight tension, as if the air itself anticipated something unwelcome. She sensed this change in the way one senses a storm before the sky darkens, an instinctive tightening in the belly, a thrum of unease beneath the ribs. Yet she moved through her chores as she always did, kneading dough with careful precision, sweeping the dust from her porch, and tending the small garden she kept behind the house. She climbed the attic ladder as the sun rose slightly higher, carrying a basin of water and a cloth. And when she saw the boy's anxious eyes fixed on her, she felt the weight of dread settle deeper. Isaac whispered that he thought he had seen someone outside the previous night, a lantern swinging through the trees. She reassured him with more confidence than she felt, brushing his hair back from his forehead, telling him that fear often made familiar shapes seem threatening. But she remembered the quiet crunch of footsteps on gravel at dusk, and the faint glimmer of something moving toward the tree line, as she understood that their margin for safety was vanishing. By noon, riders had begun circulating near the parish road, their presence described by neighbors as routine patrol. But Elise recognized the difference in their behavior. Instead of casual glances, they studied each property with intent. Instead of passing through quickly, they paused, scanning windows and sheds. The enforcement triggered by the Fugitive Slave Act had made such visits frequent over the past 5 years. Yet the men who rode past her home that day were not simply ensuring compliance, they were hunting, even from behind her curtained window. Elise could see the manner in which they leaned forward in their saddles, searching for signs of hidden life. She backed away from the window without letting her silhouette show, her heart pounding a rhythm that felt alarmingly loud in the stillness of her house. In the attic, Samuel and Isaac waited motionless, listening to every hoof beat as though each one carried the promise of danger. In communities like St. Landry Parish, suspicion gained traction not through evidence, but through repetition. By mid-afternoon, the rumor that Elise's house held someone young, someone not supposed to be there, had already reached the butcher, the seamstress, the tavern keeper, and a handful of field hands who overheard fragments between their masters' conversations. Each retelling added a slight detail, a shape of certainty that hardened into collective belief. Some said they had seen a boy's face at the attic window. Others insisted Elise had been behaving strangely since early spring. A few whispered what no one dared speak aloud publicly, that she might be risking everything to protect the runaway children from the brutal plantation. that had already gained a reputation for its merciless overseer. These murmured interpretations never reached Elisa's ears, but they created an unseen circle tightening around her. Meanwhile, on the plantation from which Samuel and Isaac had fled, the overseer Ransom Ledbetter had grown increasingly agitated. The longer the boys remained missing, the more he stood exposed as ineffective and weak in the eyes of his employer. Plantation authority depended on fear on a visible, relentless reminder that escape was futile. Every hour the boys remained at large eroded that system. He pressed the local marshal, arguing that the community's safety, the very Southern way of life, required swift action. It was a phrase repeated often during that era, a justification that masked cruelty behind the language of order. The marshal, eager to demonstrate efficiency, began dispatching deputies to interview landowners and search properties with increasing assertiveness. He carried with him a mental list of residents who, to his eye, presented a risk or lived beyond typical racial expectations. Free people of color were always on that list, and Elise, despite her quiet reputation, fit neatly into the category he viewed with suspicion. Her social position had always been precarious, respected by some, tolerated by others, and resented by a few who believed her education and propriety amounted to presumptuousness. That resentment simmered beneath the surface, waiting for an excuse to erupt. Now the rumor of hidden fugitives provided the ideal spark. By late afternoon, the deputy who had taken Roche's comment the previous day arrived at the church steps, where he spoke quietly with the priest. Though the priest generally avoided direct involvement in legal matters, he confirmed that Elise had seemed distracted lately, troubled even, though he offered no accusation. Still, the deputy interpreted the simple confession as validation. In his mind, her unease became evidence of guilt. Inside her home, Elise felt the hours stretching painfully thin, each one crowded with the awareness that discovery was imminent. She instructed the boys to keep utterly still, even as the attic's heat became nearly unbearable. The spring humidity pressed like a heavy blanket against the rafters, and sweat slicked their skin. Isaac's coughing had grown worse, a rasping sound that he tried desperately to contain. Samuel, having regained much of his strength, pressed a damp cloth to the younger boy's lips, gently urging him to breathe shallowly to muffle the sound. The smell of old wood, dust, and their own fear filled the cramped space. Occasionally, Elise climbed the ladder to check on them, bringing small portions of bread or a few figs from her garden. But each trip risked being overheard, each creak of the boards overhead carrying the potential to betray them. That evening, as shadows lengthened across her yard, another rider passed, this one moving more slowly than the others, scanning the house deliberately. Elise stood in her kitchen, hands trembling over the water basin, listening to the sound of hose pausing near her gate. The air felt as thin as paper. The horse snorted softly, followed by a rustling shift of leather. The sound of someone leaning forward in the saddle. After a long moment, the rider nudged the horse onward, but the message was clear. They were watching her now, not merely her property. When the twilight faded and night wrapped around the house, Elise lit only a single candle. Keeping the windows closed, she sat at her table, staring at the flame, trying to summon the resolve to guide the boys away through the woods that very night. But she knew the patrols would be thick, and traveling with Isaac in his weakened state would leave all of them vulnerable. She considered sending Samuel alone, but he refused, bound by a loyalty to his brother that mirrored her own sense of responsibility. She felt trapped between two impossible choices, one that risked immediate capture, and one that guaranteed eventual discovery. Meanwhile, the community's unease deepened. Tales of abolitionists had drifted into the South from newspapers and traveling preachers, fueling fears that the institution of slavery was under quiet attack. Many plantation owners claimed that free people of color were a dangerous, destabilizing influence, capable of housing runaways or encouraging ideas of resistance. Although these accusations were often baseless, they provided a convenient scapegoat whenever slave patrols failed to locate escapees. In this environment, Elisa's charitable reputation, which once had earned her polite praise, now appeared suspicious. People asked why she had never remarried, why she kept such a quiet household, why no one ever saw visitors enter or leave. The fact that she was a widow offered little protection in times of political tension. Widows were often mistrusted, seen as women capable of moral independence. 2 days after Roche's reported sighting, the marshal rode to her door with 2 deputies at his side. He did not request entry immediately. Instead, he approached with feigned courtesy, asking if she had seen any strangers near her property. Elise answered calmly, masking her fear beneath the measured politeness she had cultivated her entire life. She knew that the slightest tremor in her voice could worsen their suspicions. The marshal's eyes wandered toward the upper windows, lingering an uncomfortable moment before returning to her face. Her composure irritated him. He preferred guilt to announce itself clearly, preferred resistance to manifest visibly. When she offered no incriminating hints, he left with a forced politeness, promising that patrols would continue through the week. But as he walked away, he made a mental note to return without warning. That night, as heavy clouds gathered above the parish, Elise climbed the attic ladder for what she believed might be the last time before she would need to guide the boys to new shelter. Samuel crouched near the corner, listening to the shifting rumble of distant thunder. While Isaac lay curled against the floorboards, exhausted from fever, Elise knelt beside him, pressing the back of her hand to his cheek, feeling the heat radiating through his skin. She realized then that his weakened condition might expose them, even if they managed to flee the parish. Still, she whispered a plan one she hoped would allow them to slip past the patrols. During the coming storm, storms often made slave catchers retreat or delay their patrols. Horses struggled in the mud, and tracks became harder to follow. She told Samuel they must be ready by midnight, that she would lead them to a fisherman she trusted near Bayou, someone who owed her mother an old favor and might help the boys reach Opelousas. Samuel nodded quietly, a mix of determination and fear flickering across his face. But storms in Louisiana often arrive earlier than expected. As Elise prepared the small bundle of food and linen she planned to carry for the boys, a sharp knock echoed through her home firm. Rapid, unmistakably official, her breath caught in her chest. Another knock followed, this one louder, accompanied by a voice calling her name sharply. She froze in the kitchen doorway, hands trembling again, listening as the voice repeated her name with growing impatience. Upstairs, the boys had surely heard it too. She felt the stillness of the attic like a held breath. She approached the door slowly, smoothing her dress to maintain the appearance of calm. When she opened it, the deputy stood beneath the rising wind, his lantern flickering wildly. To other men behind him, rain had not yet begun to fall, but the air smelled of it. The deputy announced they had received further reports, neighbors claiming noises, movements, lights in her attic. He asked to come inside. Elise's world constricted into a narrow corridor of choices. She could refuse and draw immediate suspicion or comply and hope the boys stayed silent. Her mind raced through the possibilities, calculating risks with the same instinctive urgency a mother uses when protecting a child. The deputy watched her carefully, misinterpreting her hesitation as guilt. She stepped aside at last, allowing them to enter, her heartbeat pounding so violently she felt it might shake the walls themselves. The deputies began inspecting each room, opening doors, checking closets, peering beneath furniture. As they moved toward the staircase leading to the upper floor, Elise felt her knees weaken. The attic door was only a few steps above. If Isaac coughed, if Samuel shifted his weight, if any sound betrayed them, everything she had fought to protect would collapse in an instant. The deputies paused at the top of the stairs, listening. Elise held her breath. The storm wind rattled the shutters, offering a thin shield of noise. The men glanced at the attic door, then at each other. One reached for the latch dot, and at that precise moment, a surge of thunder cracked across the sky. A violent sound that made the house tremble and the lanterns flicker. Rain began pelting the windows with sudden force. The deputy jerked his hand back to steady himself, cursing under his breath about the storm. He instructed the men to continue the search quickly, muttering that they would return the next day with more officers and a warrant if needed. Elise followed them downstairs, her face composed though her limbs felt as fragile as reeds. When they finally left, the rain pouring hard enough to blur their forms, she closed the door and leaned against it, the weight of the moment sinking into her bones. She knew they would return. She knew the window of safety was gone. Above her, the attic floorboard creaked softly as the boys waited for her signal. And with the storm raging outside and the lock closing in from every direction, Elise realized that the choice she had delayed for weeks could no longer wait. The storm did not ease for hours, and for a time the relentless drumming of rain on the roof became both a blessing and a torment. It muffled movement, offering temporary cover. It had also trapped Elise inside a moment of suspended dread, unable to act, but unable to rest. She ascended the attic ladder slowly, placing each foot deliberately to avoid creaks. And when she lifted her head above the floorboards, she found Samuel sitting upright, rigid with anxiety, while Isaac lay half asleep against the wall, his breathing shallow and scratchy. The air smelled of damp wood and fever. Samuel asked with his eyes rather than his voice what had happened below, and Elise answered by crouching beside them, pulling both boys closer in a gesture that attempted to give comfort she knew she could not guarantee. The thunder rolled again, shaking the house like a distant cannon. She whispered that they had only a few hours at most before the deputies returned with determination sharpened by embarrassment. The storm bought them time, but only enough to attempt a desperate escape. She gently touched Isaac's forehead, as if the simple act of tenderness could lower his fever. His skin burned beneath her palm. The boy's eyes fluttered open briefly, cloudy with exhaustion, and Elise felt her heart twist with the knowledge that this escape might be too much for him. Yet leaving him behind was inconceivable. The world beyond this attic had shown him nothing but cruelty. Asterisk below them. The wind battered the shutters hard enough to loosen the latch on the back window, sending it clattering. Elise flinched. Even ordinary sounds felt amplified under threat. She told Samuel to prepare Isaac, to gather what little strength he had, and then descended to pack the small bundle more carefully, ensuring the food was easy to carry and that a bottle of water was wrapped securely to prevent sound. As she moved through the dim rooms, candle trembling in her hand, she could not help but think of the night her mother had once aided a stranger, a woman with a newborn, shivering and terrified, seeking refuge on a path of uncertain deliverance. Elise had been a child then, watching from the doorway, not yet understanding the political danger of such an act. It was only years later that she realized her mother had passed down more than lessons in cooking, sewing, and prayer. She had instilled an uncompromising belief that duty did not bend to fear when a vulnerable life stood in need. That inheritance now compelled Elise more strongly than self-preservation. Still, as she folded a wool shawl into the bundle, her hands shook not from doubt, but from the magnitude of what lay ahead. The storm would cover their departure, but it would also complicate it. Mud, rising water, fallen branches each could slow them, leaving traces for hunters to find once the sky cleared. By the time Elise returned to the attic, the storm's full force had arrived, lightning illuminating the rafters in brief, stark flashes. Samuel had managed to coax Isaac into sitting upright, supporting him with an arm around his shoulders. Isaac's breath rattled faintly, the fever sapping his already fragile stamina. He attempted to speak, but Elise hushed him quickly. Conserving his strength was now as vital as silence. She handed Samuel the small bundle, instructing him to divide the weight between them so Isaac could be carried when necessary. Samuel nodded, determination sharpening his features in the dim light. The boy, who only weeks earlier had been weakened and afraid, now held a quiet resolve that reminded Elise of those rare accounts she had read of enslaved people escaping not through strength but through will and unyielding belief that the life waiting on the other side of danger was worth the suffering required to reach it. They descended the ladder together, Elise going first to steady the boys. The floorboards groaned softly under their combined weight, though the storm masked it. She paused at each threshold, listening for footsteps outside or voices carried on the wind. The house shuddered with every burst of thunder, giving her brief cover to open the back door without the usual metallic scrape announcing it. The yard beyond was nearly invisible under the rain. Water streamed down the steps, turning soil into thick brown pools that swallowed footprints instantly. She wrapped a shawl around Isaac, pulling the hood low to shield his face. Samuel slipped his arm beneath Isaac's, lifting most of his weight as they stepped into the storm. The cold rain struck their skin with punishing force, soaking their clothing within seconds. Elise guided them toward the edge of the property, choosing the narrow path between the pecan trees where branches created a partial canopy. The storm made the path treacherous, but the darkness hid them at the tree line. She hesitated, glancing back at the faint outline of her house. The lantern she had left on the kitchen table flickered softly, a fragile, human glow swallowed by the blackness beyond. She felt a pang of grief for the home that had sheltered them until now, the place that held the memory of her mother and the quiet routines of a life never fully accepted by the community around her. She knew she might never return. Yet when she turned toward Samuel and Isaac, that grief yielded to purpose. She motioned for them to continue, leading them onto a narrow hunter's trail that cut through the forest, its ground already flooding. As they moved deeper into the woods, their progress slowed. The mud clung to their shoes, sucking with each step, threatening to pull Isaac's feet from under him. Samuel tightened his grip, murmuring encouragement without words. Elise kept scanning the darkness for patrols, though the storm likely deterred riders from venturing too far. Still she remained vigilant, She knew too well that desperation could drive men to follow footprints even in the rain. The forest around them seemed alive with noised branches snapping under the weight of water, wind roaring through the canopy, distant thunder echoing like rolling drums. Each sound carried the possibility of danger. Elise paused often, listening for anything that did not belong. Their destination lay several miles east, near Bayou, where an aging fisherman named Etienne lived alone in a weathered cabin. He was known for keeping to himself, uninterested in the political currents that dominated plantation life. For years he had sold shrimp and catfish in the central market, often exchanging quiet conversations with Elise's mother about the unpredictability of storms and the shifting patterns of river currents. After her mother's death, he continued those subdued greetings with Elise whenever their paths crossed. She did not know whether he would help the boys, but she trusted the memory of his kindness more than the certainty of any other option. If anyone could ferry the boys along the bayou under cover of night, it was him. But the journey to his cabin proved far more difficult than Elise had anticipated. Isaac's fever intensified, draining his strength with alarming speed. His legs buckled more than once, forcing Samuel to carry him entirely for stretches. Elise tried to lighten Samuel's burden, taking one of Isaac's arms over her shoulder. But the boy's weight, despite his small frame, became harder to manage as the path grew slicker. At one point, Isaac shivered so violently that Elise feared he would collapse entirely. She pressed her hand against his cheek again, wishing she had brought more water or the herbs from her kitchen that might lower a fever. But necessity had allowed no time for preparation. The storm and the deputy's threats forced them into motion before she could gather remedies. The forest eventually thinned as they approached the winding bend toward the bayou. The smell of brackish water drifted through the air, mingling with damp leaves and decaying logs. Lightning momentarily illuminated a portion of the river bank ahead, revealing the dark silhouette of Etienne's cabin perched on stilts above the rising water. Relief surged through Elise so intensely she nearly stumbled. They were close now. The hardest part of the journey seemed behind them until she heard voices, faint, carried by the wind, indistinguishable at first, then clearer, men calling to one another, likely deputies or patrol riders who had moved their search toward the water's edge. Elise grabbed Samuel's arm, pulling him and Isaac into a dense thicket of palmetto. They crouched low, the rain pounding so hard it masked the sound of their breathing. Elise's pulse thundered in her ears. The lantern lights glowed through the trees, swaying with the movement of the men carrying them. They were searching systematically, sweeping their lights in arcs across the forest floor. One lantern paused near a set of muddy footprints, not theirs, but close enough to make Elise's blood run cold. The deputy examined the prints briefly, then moved on. Elise held the boys close, whispering for stillness with a hand lightly on Samuel's back. The lanterns drifted away slowly, swallowed by darkness and rain. Only when the voices faded into the distance did Elise move again. She guided the boys along a different path, one that curved wide around the spot where the deputies had stood. The detour added precious time they could not afford, but it avoided direct detection. Isaac's breathing had grown ragged, hitching with each step, his body slumping against them as though sleep might overcome him at any moment. Elise knew they needed shelter soon, not just for safety, but for Isaac's survival. When they finally reached the riverbank near Etienne's cabin, they discovered a new obstacle. The water level had risen sharply with the storm, flooding the steps and making the ground slick and unstable. Elise climbed the steps with difficulty, knocking on the cabin door with urgency softened only by exhaustion. For a moment nothing happened. She knocked again, then the door creaked open, revealing the fisherman's weathered face, eyes narrowing at the sight of her drenched figure, and the two boys slumped behind her. Recognition flickered in his gaze, followed by surprise, concern, and the unspoken dread of implication. Elise spoke quickly, her voice hardly audible over the rain, explaining just enough for him to understand the urgency without burdening him with details that might endanger him further. Etienne stepped aside at last, gesturing for them to enter. The cabin smelled of river mud, tobacco, and fish nets drying by the fire. It was small but warm, the hearth's glow casting a faint orange light across the wooden walls. Samuel carried Isaac to a cot in the corner, laying him down gently. The boy shivered violently, his fever rising. Etienne retrieved a blanket, wrapping it around Isaac's shoulders, then turned to Elise with a question in his eyes, not of accusation, but of what she needed him to do next. She told him they were being hunted, that deputies might arrive within hours, that the boys needed to reach Opelousas or farther if possible. Etienne exhaled heavily, his weathered face creased with resignation. Helping them would risk everything he owned, everything he depended on for survival. Yet he did not hesitate long. There were men in Louisiana who avoided choosing sides, and men who refused cruelty even when neutrality was safer. Etienne had always quietly belonged to the latter. He moved to prepare his small skiff, checking the ropes and supplies despite the rising wind. Elise watched him, her heart aching with gratitude mixed with fear. She knew the journey ahead would be perilous. The Bayou current swelled dangerously after storms, and patrols often watched the waterways more closely than land routes. But there was no alternative. Remaining in the cabin would bring deputies to Etienne's door once the morning search resumed. As Etienne readied the boat, Isaac drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring softly. Samuel stayed by his side, whispering reassurance. Elise sat near the fire, wringing water from her skirt, feeling her limbs tremble, not from cold, but from the enormity of everything pressing upon her. At once fear for the boys, fear of being discovered, fear of what waited once she returned home, or what might happen if she never did. But beneath that fear was something steadier, conviction. She had made her choice. She had acted according to the truth she inherited from her mother and from every person who had ever risked their safety to protect innocence in a world shaped by violence and hierarchy. A sudden knock on the cabin door jolted everyone. Etienne froze, his knife halfway through cutting a length of rope. The knock came again, louder this time. Elise's breath caught. She motioned the boys deeper into the cabin shadows. Storm or not, someone had tracked them. Etienne stepped toward the door slowly, placing his hand on the latch as if testing its weight. Outside, thunder rumbled, masking the low murmur of voices. The lantern light seeping through the cracks beneath the door flickered ominously. And then the knock came a third time, sharp, insistent, unmistakably official. The nights that followed the failed plantation search settled over the matron's house, with a strange mixture of quiet dread and sharpened intuition, creating a heaviness that seemed to press against the walls themselves. The two boys, who had learned to move with the soft, anticipatory caution of hunted creatures, adjusted their sleeping positions so they could hear the houses breathing through the beams. The matron sensed the change as easily as she had once sensed a storm forming over the cane fields. She understood that slave catchers rarely gave up after a single search, especially not when Louisiana's newspapers were stitching runaway notices with growing detail and urgency. Even if the men had left empty-handed, they had not left unconvinced. She had seen suspicion in the way they lingered, in the way one man's hand drifted to the grip of a lantern hook, as though imagining how easily fire could coax truth out of a wooden home. She knew they would return, emboldened, authorized, or drunk enough to invent justification. And so she began to reinforce the routines of survival around the house with renewed discipline, smoothing over any inconsistency that could betray them. She coached the boys quietly, not with commands, but through example, showing them how she moved tools to new positions, adjusted the arrangement of fabrics in the sewing room, kept the kettle warm, but not boiling so that the house felt neither fully inhabited nor strangely inactive. With every motion, she folded them more firmly into her protection, and the boys absorbed each detail with the urgency of those who know that learning might decide whether they live to see another sunrise. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of the district, rumors grew swollen and misshapen as they passed from porch to porch. Some neighbors whispered that they had long suspected the widow of improper sympathy, pointing to her refusal to hire out enslaved labor after her husband's death as a sign of unnatural sentiment. Others, more cautious in their gossip, wondered whether her once respected household had become a quiet refuge for abolitionist sympathizers who, though sparse in Louisiana, were not entirely absent. There were murmurs that the matron had allowed a seamstress years earlier to escape punishment for reading abolitionist pamphlets smuggled downriver. Someone claimed she had overpaid enslaved carpenters from another plantation after they repaired storm damage, slipping them coins in private, a small act but enough to make her stand out in a region where generosity toward enslaved people was considered not kindness but weakness. These stories, layered with half-facts and outright imagination, revived themselves in the collective anxiety of a society built on control, fueling the belief that any deviation from rigid loyalty might signal treachery. And as these rumors swirled, they naturally converged onto the question of the missing boys, amplifying speculation that the matron's house with its covered windows, early extinguished lamps, and occasional locked shutters had become the center of a conspiracy worthy of intervention. But within the house, a different world unfolded, one that had its own rhythm, governed not by suspicion, but by careful humanity. The boys, though confined, began to adapt physically and emotionally to the space. Drawing comfort from the small sanctuary that the matron had created, she brought them snippets of the outside world in the form of overheard conversations at market, describing which plantations had increased patrols, which streets were being watched by constables, which river docks were rumored to be monitored more closely after a series of escape attempts. The boys listened with focused intensity, trying to map the shifting terrain of danger beyond the walls. She also brought them practical tools for their private mental survival. Pieces of charcoal to mark silent patterns onto the attic boards, scraps of paper for the older boy to write fragments of scripture he remembered from plantation services, and dried herbs that eased the younger boy's winter cough. In return, the boys kept the attic ordered, arranging crates, sweeping dust, and maintaining the matron's deliberate illusion of an untouched storage space. Every act between them passing a cup of water, tightening a cloth wrap around a creaking joint in the rafters, sharing news of steps on the porch became a thread strengthening their fragile but deepening bond. Yet beneath this careful choreography, the matron carried a growing burden of fear that she concealed from the boys with disciplined quiet. She had begun to notice more movement on the road, riders passing twice, sometimes 3 times a day, wagons slowing near her fence, strangers pausing to examine the direction of her chimney's smoke. One afternoon, she saw a pair of local men standing outside the apothecary whispering as she passed, their eyes following her with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. She bought her remedies quickly and returned home with her shoulders rigid, acutely aware that every glance at her basket, every comment about her late husband's estate, every polite question about whether she needed help with farm maintenance, could be a pretext to detect hesitation in her voice. Slave catchers rarely relied on forced searches alone. They collected small pieces of daily life, drawing conclusions from the faintest shift in behavior. And the matron had changed, she knew it. She moved less casually, avoided conversations that once came easily, and kept her answers brief to avoid revealing the tension beneath her words. Fear was becoming visible, and visibility in a slave-holding region was danger. The boys sensed her anxiety even before she spoke of heightened risks. They could hear it in the sharper whisper of her footsteps, see it in the more hurried way she arranged her sewing orders, and feel it in how long she paused before ascending the attic stairs each night. Their growing awareness tempered their small moments of hope, reminding them that the world outside was still closing in. The older boy, whose memories of plantation discipline had taught him how to read adult fear, watched the lines around the matron's eyes deepen with each passing day. He tried to reassure her in his own quiet ways, helping more with repairs, storing food more neatly, tracking the sound of patrols from the attic beams. But he also felt the heavy truth settling inside him. No matter how brave or resourceful the matron was, Louisiana's systems of power were designed to stretch far beyond one woman's courage. He knew, though she never said it aloud, that their time in the attic could not continue indefinitely. The younger boy, who was more prone to instinct than analysis, clung to the safety of the attic with a child's fragile faith. But even he began to feel the pressure when one night the matron arrived visibly shaken, breath caught in her throat, explaining that men had stood for several minutes near her back door, as if debating whether they had the right to knock out asterisk as winter crept in. The political climate in Louisiana further darkened the atmosphere around the household. The Fugitive Slave Act, though enacted 5 years earlier, had empowered bounty hunters across the South with greater confidence, and newspapers in New Orleans were editorializing about Northern meddling with renewed bitterness. Stories circulated of harsher punishments for captured runaways, of increased rewards for informants, and of local councils urging citizens to report any unusual behavior that might signal abolitionist activity. Even plantation owners, who had previously shown little interest in the broader legal disputes, began acting aggressively to protect their property interests, hiring additional watchmen and pushing local authorities to prioritize investigations. This rising tension created an environment where the smallest suspicion could escalate rapidly, and the matron's name began appearing more often in conversations about households that required reassessment. Her quiet reputation as a woman who did not fully align with the region's values made her an easy target for speculation, especially among men whose livelihoods depended on maintaining the brutal economic order. The tightening scrutiny forced her to consider contingency plans she had not yet shared with the boys. She began scouting routes along the bayou at dawn, searching for unguarded paths that might lead them toward safer territory. though she understood how difficult escape would be. Louisiana's geography favored captors, swamp-swallowed footprints, riverboats were monitored, and patrols moved unpredictably through rural roads. She also contemplated speaking to a trusted free black family who lived 2 miles away, a household respected but cautious, known for helping with small acts of resistance, but rarely involving themselves in high-risk matters. She hesitated, though, knowing that burdening them with such knowledge could put them at risk of jail or worse. Every decision now carried multiple layers of danger, and the matron felt the weight of each possible misstep pressing against her composure. Inside the attic, time began to feel stretched, suspended between hope and inevitability. The boys continued to busy themselves with tasks, but even the younger one could feel a change in the air. He asked fewer questions about when they might leave the attic and instead started asking whether the matron was safe when she walked to the market. The older boy spent hours mapping imagined routes through the countryside, pressing his ear to the boards to listen not just for footsteps, but for the tone of voices outside, whether they were casual, searching, or tense. The attic became a small world filled with heightened senses, a place where survival depended as much on listening as on hiding. Still, the matron refused to allow fear to hollow out their days entirely. She insisted they eat well, sleep early, and maintain strength, knowing that physical resilience would matter in whatever future awaited them. She told them stories from her childhood tales of river floods, of her mother's bravery during a yellow fever outbreak, of her husband's early kindness before plantation life hardened him, as a way to anchor them to humanity amid the dehumanizing reality they faced. The boys, in turn, shared fragments of their own memories, the scent of crushed cane, the feel of summer dust under bare feet, the rare laughter of a fellow enslaved child. These exchanges created a fragile but profoundly real sense of family, built not by blood but by shared danger and mutual protection. But beneath these moments of connection, an undeniable truth loomed. Louisiana's systems of surveillance and suspicion were tightening around the matron's home, and the space for safety was shrinking. The rumors outside were growing louder, more pointed, and more confidently spoken. The search parties felt emboldened, and the men who had once failed to find evidence were not men accustomed to leaving a job unfinished. The matron could feel their return approaching, not through specific signs, but through the instinct that had guided her through years of widowhood, plantation management, and quiet defiance. She knew that the next confrontation would not resemble the first. It would be harder, more invasive, less bound by courtesy. Something was coming, something she could neither delay nor fully prepare for. And as she moved through her house that evening, extinguishing lamps one by one, she understood that the fragile sanctuary she had built was entering its most perilous moment yet, where one misheard sound or one misplaced object could unravel everything. The days that followed carried the feeling of a tightening rope, quiet at first, then unmistakably constricting, as if every hour in the matron's house was being measured and weighed by eyes that had not yet revealed themselves. The air held a heavier stillness, and the boys felt it most acutely at night, when the sounds of distant dogs and passing wagons seemed to travel farther through the winter air. The matron, who had grown increasingly vigilant, began to alter her routine in subtle ways that might appear normal to any outsider, but were intended to shield the boys from detection. She started leaving certain doors slightly ajar so that nothing would seem deliberately hidden. She took up many for neighbors again, tasks she had not done regularly in months, so that her presence in the community would not seem withdrawn or unusual. She even forced herself to linger on porches in conversation, listening politely to gossip she wished to flee from, because appearing hurried could attract notice. Each choice felt like walking a tightrope between caution and exposure, and although she carried herself with controlled composure, the weight of her fear had begun to settle in her shoulders and voice. One morning, as she returned from town with a sack of dried beans and a length of coarse linen, she overheard 2 men speaking faintly near the general store. They mentioned that search riders had begun sweeping properties again, beginning with households near the river. Their casual tone belied the threat embedded in the words, and the matron felt a tremor run through her limbs as she walked past without acknowledging them. She knew that riders sweeping properties rarely limited themselves to river homes. Their routes expanded with each search, and sooner or later they would circle back to her door. The boys sensed something in her demeanor that afternoon, her quiet pacing, her distracted gaze when she lit the stove end, although she tried to keep her movements steady. They instinctively understood that danger was drawing near. The older boy listened intently for any unusual sound outside, while the younger clung to the matron's brief moments of warmth as if they were lifelines. The sense of an approaching shift, a turning point that none of them could fully articulate, settled over the household like an invisible fog dot as evening came. The matron found herself dwelling on memories she had long kept at bay, moments from her marriage that had shaped the woman she had become. She remembered nights when her husband hosted local planters who spoke with unsettling ease about punishments delivered to enslaved people, the laughter that followed stories of recaptured runaways, and the way such conversations seeped into the walls of the home like a permanent stain. There had been a time when she had accepted these gatherings as part of her social world, even sitting among the wives who pretended not to hear the darker comments exchanged over whiskey. But she also remembered the quiet shame she felt the first time she witnessed a chained man being marched down the road outside her window, his back strapped from a plantation whip, while her husband remarked that fear kept order. It was that moment, she realized years later, that had awakened the part of her that resisted silently, the part that now risked everything for the boys hidden above her head. This reflection brought her not comfort, but clarity, reminding her why she could not abandon them, not now, not with danger closing in dot in the attic. Meanwhile, the boys continued to adapt to the rhythm of confinement, though fear seeped into their thoughts more often than before. The younger boy asked the older one if riders would come again, and though the older boy tried to sound reassured, uncertainty weighed on every word he offered. He remembered the men on the plantation, men whose faces twisted with pleasure when recapturing runaways, and he knew that those pursuing them now were no different. He could picture their boots, their lanterns, their determination to restore property to its rightful place. These memories darkened his sleep, and he often woke to the faint creaking of the house, unsure whether the sound was real or an echo of remembered terror. Yet within this fear, he found a strange anchor, the matron's continued presence. Every time she climbed the stairs at dusk, her footsteps slow and steady, he felt the faintest sense of grounding, as if survival itself were tethered to her resolve. One night, after a particularly tense day of increased patrol activity near the outskirts of town, the matron brought the boys a small wrapped bundle of cornbread and salted pork, more food than usual. She did not explain why, but her intentions were clear. Whatever was coming might leave them without meals for a day or more. The boys ate slowly, sensing the shift not through words, but through her unspoken urgency. After they finished, she lingered longer than usual in the dim attic light, studying the boards, the walls, the crates, checking for any sign that might betray their presence. She touched the edges of the loose panel with deliberate precision, listening to the wood. The boys watched her in silence, and her expression, though calm, carried a depth of concern they had rarely seen so openly. When she finally left, descending the narrow stairs with a heaviness that echoed through the boards, both boys felt the air thicken with the unspoken truth. The next hours or days would test them more than any that had come before. The next morning brought an eerie stillness. No early wagons passed, no workers shouted from the fields, no dogs barked in nearby yards. The silence felt unnatural, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The matron moved through the house with a tense awareness, wiping surfaces, adjusting curtains, and checking each window latch with motions that bordered on ritualistic. She set a pot of water on the stove without lighting the fire, and every few minutes she paused to listen for activity outside. Around mid-morning, she heard the distant clatter of hooves, slow, deliberate, unmistakably purposeful. Her heart beat faster, but she forced herself to remain composed, adjusting her shawl as she approached the front window. Through the thin fabric curtain, she saw them, 3 riders, dressed in heavy coats, lanterns strapped to their saddles despite the daylight. They were heading down the road toward her property, their posture stiff and practiced, their pace to measure to be casual travelers. Her pulse quickened, but she knew she had no time to panic. If they reached her door, she would need to meet them with the calm of a woman accustomed to living alone, a widow with nothing to hide. She moved briskly but carefully, ensuring the house appeared lived in yet unremarkable. She placed the kettle on the stove, but did not turn it. She opened the Bible on the small table near the window, as though she had been reading. She smoothed the fabric on her dress and pinched her cheeks lightly, to bring color to her face, an old trick she had used during her husband's lifetime. When guests arrived unannounced, the boys, hearing the distant hooves, pressed themselves against the attic floorboards, their hearts pounding so loudly they feared the sound might seep through the wood. When the knock finally came sharp, authoritative, echoing through the quiet morning, the matron exhaled slowly and walked to the door. With measured steps, She opened it to find the same men who had searched her home weeks earlier, accompanied by a new face, a deputy known for his severity, a man whose presence alone suggested this was no routine visit. He introduced himself formally and explained that they had received credible information, suggesting recent runaway activity in the area. The matron felt the words settle heavily in the air around her. They asked whether she had noticed anything unusual near her property, any strange tracks, any unfamiliar faces passing through. She answered steadily, choosing her words carefully, offering just enough detail to seem cooperative, but not enough to invite deeper inquiry. But she could feel their eyes assessing her, studying her expressions, her breathing, the calm she worked so tirelessly to maintain. Then came the inevitable request. They needed to search again, more thoroughly this time. The matron hesitated only long enough to seem surprised, not fearful, and then stepped aside, gesturing politely for them to enter. Inside, they moved with greater confidence than before, their boots leaving sharp imprints on her wooden floors. They opened drawers, inspected cupboards, lifted rugs. The younger of the men ran his fingers along the edges of furniture as though feeling for dust that might hint at recent disturbance. The deputy walked into her sewing room, examining every basket and fabric pile with unyielding suspicion. The matron stayed nearby, hands clasped in front of her apron, forcing her breath to stay even. The boys above listened with wide eyes, their bodies tensed into stillness, each footstep below sending vibrations through the beams. When the men approached the hallway leading to the attic stairs, the matron's heart lurched, though she kept her posture calm. She explained quickly but without sounding rushed that the attic had suffered structural instability. In the summer storms, she rarely went up there except to store old furniture. She mentioned that the boards were weak, sometimes unsafe to walk on, especially for men wearing heavy boots. Her tone carried just enough concern to sound plausible, without sounding like a warning. The deputy studied her face closely, and for a moment she feared he might insist. But after a brief exchange of glances between the men, they decided to look only from below, shining their lanterns up the narrow stairwell, but not ascending. The flickering light cast long, wavering shadows across the attic rafters, and the boys pressed themselves flatter against the boards, barely daring to breathe. After several hours that felt like days, the men finally left with curt acknowledgments, though their departure offered no relief. The matron knew their choice not to search the attic fully was due less to belief in her words, and more to time, fatigue, and the limits of their current authority. She also knew they would not leave the situation unresolved. As their horses trotted away, she leaned against the doorframe, steadying herself against the trembling that had finally broken through her composure. In the attic, the boys exhaled shakily, their small sanctuary preserved for the moment, but newly fragile. The danger had not passed. It had merely sharpened, and as the matron locked the door for the evening, she recognized that this search marked the beginning of a more relentless pursuit, one that would force her to confront the limits of her courage, the reach of the law, and the uncertain future that awaited all three of them. The night after the search left the matron's home in a state of suspended quiet and uneasy, a natural stillness where even the familiar groan of the old house sounded altered, as if the beams themselves sensed the tightening noose around them. The boys lay awake long after darkness settled, listening for footsteps that never came, for lanterns that never flickered beneath the attic door, for shouts that never split the silence. Yet the absence of immediate danger brought little comfort. Instead, it magnified the uncertainty of what would follow. The older boy found himself replaying every sound from earlier that day, the thud of boots, the scraping of drawers, the low murmurs of the men as they spoke among themselves. He wondered if one of them had noticed something small, something the matron hadn't caught, something that might compel them to return. Beside him, the younger boy clutched the edges of the thin blanket, his breath shallow and irregular, his mind caught between exhaustion and fear. Neither spoke. Even whispering felt dangerous now, as though words themselves might draw unwanted attention to the fragile refuge that remained. Downstairs, the matron sat at her small kitchen table with the oil lamp turned low, staring at the Bible she had opened earlier for the officers. The pages were unchanged, but their meaning felt different now. She traced her fingers over the worn leather binding, remembering how many times she had rested her hand upon it during her husband's lifetime, sometimes in genuine prayer, sometimes as a shield against his expectations, sometimes out of habit alone. Tonight, her hand trembled not in fear, but in the weight of the choices she knew were coming. She had always understood that harboring runaway children could not continue indefinitely. She had known from the first moment she saw their desperate eyes that these boys were stepping into a life defined by danger, and yet she had made her choice anyway. But now the stakes were rising in ways she had not fully anticipated. The deputy's expression was still imprinted in her mind, the way he had searched her face for inconsistencies, the way he had lingered near the attic stairs, the way his silence held more threat than his words. She sensed he was a man who disliked leaving questions unanswered. That meant he would return. As the days passed, the matron began to adjust her behavior again, but with a sharpness that reflected the pressing urgency. She shortened her interactions in town, staying only long enough to purchase essentials, then returning straight home without visiting neighbors. She made sure not to carry too many supplies at once so as not to draw suspicion about additional mouths to feed. She checked her fences and exterior shutters with deliberate care, not to improve the property, but to ensure that any sign of disturbance could not be interpreted as hidden activity. She kept the boys in the attic for longer stretches, sometimes the entire day, even when she knew it strained their spirits. She became more disciplined in her movements, as though bracing herself for an approaching storm. Yet despite this heightened vigilance, the house felt increasingly vulnerable, as though every sound outside was a signal, every visitor a potential threat, every passing wagon a harbinger of discovery. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by unexpectedly, a woman known for her curiosity and her tendency to linger near windows while pretending to admire furnishings. The matron forced herself to smile warmly, inviting her inside and offering her tea. But even as they spoke of weather and garden pests, the matron could feel the neighbor's eyes drifting toward the staircase, her tone carrying a probing edge disguised beneath polite chatter. She asked whether the matron had heard about the increased trouble near town, about strange footprints found beyond the cotton fields, about a rumor that the boys had slipped through the fingers of a search party weeks earlier. The matron responded with careful ignorance, but she felt every muscle tighten, knowing how quickly friendly conversation could transform into deadly suspicion. When the neighbor finally left, she stood on the porch for several minutes asking seemingly harmless questions about fences and livestock before offering a drawn-out goodbye that made the matron's pulse quicken. Only when the woman disappeared down the road did the matron allow her shoulders to slump, wiping dampness from her palms as she re-entered the house. That night, the matron did not sleep. She sat in her sewing room with the lantern extinguished, watching the faint bluish glow of moonlight reflected on her husband's old tobacco tin. She thought of the last runaway case she had heard discussed among local planters. How a man had been caught hiding to enslave men in a woodshed. How the patrol had beaten him even though he was white. How his property was confiscated and his reputation shattered. She remembered how her husband had commented that such outcomes were necessary to preserve order in a world where sympathy could become contagious. The irony was not lost on her now. The very system her husband had defended was the system she now defied, risking everything to undo even the smallest fragment of its cruelty. She wondered what he would have said if he could see her in this moment. Standing guard over the boys, he would have considered no more than assets of another household. But she also felt a deep certainty that her husband's voice no longer mattered. The world did not change because of men like him, it changed because of those who resisted quietly, until their resistance could no longer be ignored. While the matron wrestled with her fears, the boys struggled through their own emotional reckoning. The younger boy, sensing the growing tension, spent hours burying his face in his knees, trying not to cry so the older boy wouldn't see. His memories of the plantation came back in vivid fragments. The way overseers walked in the early dawn with whips coiled at their sides, the feeling of mud between his toes as he carried water from the well, the sound of his mother's voice calling him in the evenings before she was sold away. He had been so young then, barely able to grasp the meaning of separation. But now that memory rose sharply the moment when she clung to him before being pulled away, her cries muffled by the rough hands of a traitor. He had thought he had forgotten her voice, but in the close, suffocating darkness of the attic, he found himself whispering her name, wondering if she would have told him to run, to hide, to endure. The older boy heard these muffled whispers and felt a protective ache growing inside him. He wished he could promise safety, but he knew enough about the world to understand such promises were fragile things. Instead, he took the younger boy's hand and squeezed it quietly, an unspoken vow that he would do everything in his power to keep him alive, even if the world outside was sharpening its knives. As the week progressed, the sense of impending intrusion became unavoidable. Patrol riders passed by the house twice, then 3 times, each time moving slower, their lanterns swinging with deliberate precision as though searching for subtle signs. A disturbed patch of dirt, a moved shutter, a misplaced pail. The matron began to keep the house dim at night, extinguishing most lamps to reduce shadows that might betray movement. She walked through the rooms barefoot, so her steps would not echo, listening carefully for the faintest sound outside. On the third night, as she sat in her rocking chair with the house cloaked in near complete darkness, she heard riders stop directly in front of her property. Her breath caught. She leaned slightly toward the window, careful not to be seen, but rather than dismounting, the riders simply waited silent, unmoving, as if listening. Minutes passed like hours until finally the horses began to move again, their hooves thudding softly as they disappeared down the road. But the message was unmistakable. The men were narrowing their search. The next morning, as dew glistened on the outer fence, the matron made a decision she had avoided for weeks. She ascended the narrow attic steps with slow, heavy footsteps and sat beside the boys, her voice low and strained. She did not speak of fear. She did not mention the riders or the neighbor or the deputy whose return felt inevitable. Instead, she talked quietly about routes leading north, rough directions she had memorized during years of hearing whispers from free black families, itinerant laborers, and traveling abolitionists who passed through Louisiana on dangerous missions. She described how some runaways followed the river until they reached safer communities, how others slipped into wagon caravans or traveled by night through forest paths. No patrol would dare enter alone. She told them about the places where sympathetic households might offer shelter, where signs carved subtly into trees pointed the way toward safety. She did not present it as an instruction, only as knowledge the boys needed if the worsening circumstances forced them to leave. More quickly than planned, the older boy listened with intense concentration, absorbing every detail, while the younger boy stared at her with wide eyes, sensing that her words carried a terrible, necessary gravity. That evening, lightning flickered on the horizon, and thunder rumbled like distant cannon fire. A storm was approaching, a real one, not the metaphorical kind that had been building for weeks. As the sky darkened, the matron felt a strange mixture of dread and relief. Storms could conceal noise, obscure tracks, and delay search parties. They could also destroy everything in their path. She made her rounds through the house, securing shutters and checking doors. But her mind churned with a painful realization. She could not protect the boys much longer. Not because her resolve was weakening, but because the world outside was tightening its grip, circling ever closer. And she could no longer assume that a well-chosen lie or a carefully controlled expression would be enough. Something was going to break, whether the law, her safety, or the fragile equilibrium she had maintained for so long. As thunder cracked overhead and rain began to lash against the shutters, the matron stood alone in the center of her dim kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She closed her eyes and allowed herself one brief moment, one rare moment of acknowledging the fear she carried. Then she opened her eyes again, straightened her posture, and prepared for what she knew was coming. The storm was only beginning, in more ways than one. In the months that followed the shuttering of the Dupree house, Louisiana carried on as if the silence inside that attic had never existed. Yet something in the social fabric had shifted in a way too subtle for newspapers to track, or politicians to debate. What lingered was not the sensational charge of harboring fugitives, but the deeper unease of a community forced to recognize how fragile its imagined order truly was. In parlors and markets and courthouse corridors, people spoke of Madame Celestini either as a woman who had narrowly escaped the noose, or as one who had suffered unjustly under the weight of suspicion. And in these conversations, the divide between fear and conscience became more visible. It was not her acquittal that unsettled them, but the revelation that such an act, whether she committed it or not, could spring from beneath the veneer of respectability they so vigorously protected. Behind every closed door lay the possibility of a moral boundary bending, not with defiance, but with quiet determination. And the thought of that possibility changed how some looked at their neighbors and perhaps even how they looked at themselves. Those who had watched the trial closely recalled how Madame Celestini had never once attempted to reclaim her old social standing in the months after the verdict. Instead, she retreated into a kind of contemplative anonymity, moving through the city with the same composure she had carried into the courthouse, but without the studied grace that once framed her presence. It was as if the trial had removed the last illusion she held about belonging. Illusions she seemed more than willing to relinquish. She refused interviews, ignored invitations, and allowed the Dupree estate to fall into a slow decline, not out of negligence, but out of a deliberate loosening of her ties to the world. that had judged her. Servants trimmed the hedges less often, shutters lost their shine, and the once busy veranda, where she had greeted guests, now rested under layers of fallen leaves. People speculated as they passed the house, but she paid these whispers no mind. Her focus had turned inward, toward the private mathematics of loss, memory, and moral duty equations that did not resolve neatly, but demanded continual reckoning. Rumors persisted, of course. Some whispered that the boys she had been accused of hiding had fled farther south, carried by riverboats or helped by free black communities along the Gulf. Others insisted they had never been in her attic at all, that the entire case was an elaborate performance staged by authorities, desperate to make an example of someone respectable enough to frighten the undecided. Still others claimed they had seen Madame Celestini walking alone along the riverbank late at night, staring out at the slow, moonlit churn of the Mississippi with the expression of a woman who had given something up that she would never speak of. None of these stories could be proven, yet their persistence said more about the collective conscience of the city than about the woman herself. They needed a narrative that made sense of her silence, a frame to contain the unsettling possibility that she had acted on principles they themselves had long ignored. Meanwhile, the two boys Jonas and Patrick became phantoms woven into the layered folklore of the region. River workers claimed they had once seen the young men assisting on a flatboat heading inland. Traders swore they had glimpsed familiar faces among caravans moving north, and in some quarters of the city, free black families told hushed stories of strangers taken in for a night, fed, clothed, and passed along under the cover of darkness. None of these sightings could be confirmed, yet the effect of these tales was profound. They created a kind of moral echo that began to reshape the narrative of the Dupré case, pulling attention away from guilt and legality and toward the larger reality that countless young people like the two boys slipped through the margins of the slave-holding world, every year named, unrecorded, but not entirely forgotten. Their anonymity was their protection, but also their erasure, and the community's attempt to imagine their fates revealed a growing discomfort with that erasure. By late 1856, when political tensions in the country were shifting toward what would eventually become irreversible rupture, scholars and clergymen in the region quietly began referencing the Dupré case as an example of how even the most polished households could become points of fracture in the institution of slavery, not because a single woman had defied the law, though many believed she had, but because the very accusation exposed the contradictions built into the system. The state required absolute control to maintain slavery, but that control was constantly undermined by acts of compassion, quiet resistance, and the unpredictable movements of the enslaved themselves. The Dupré edict became a symbol not of rebellion in the dramatic sense, but of the dangerous power of private conscience to disrupt public order. And though no plaques were carved and no sermons openly commemorated it, the story circulated in whispers through taverns, boarding schools, and market stalls where people grappled with its implications. For Madame Celestini, the weight of the trial and its aftermath did not manifest as bitterness, but as a deepened resolve to step cautiously yet deliberately through the remaining years of her life. She continued her charitable work, though more discreetly than before, directing clothing, food, and occasional coins to women and children living along the city's less forgiving edges. She spoke little of the past, but those who knew her noted that she had developed a new habit, pausing whenever she heard footsteps above or behind her, as if attics and hallways had become metaphors she could not quite let go of. In quieter moments, she was said to study the sky through her parlor windows, watching the shifting Louisiana clouds with a contemplative intensity that suggested she was searching for something, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps confirmation, or perhaps the simple knowledge that the world she had tried to soften, even briefly, had not been entirely unmoved. As years continued their slow advance, the city around her changed in ways both visible and subtle. New wharves were built, neighborhoods expanded, the political climate grew more volatile, and yet the imprint of the Dupré case did not fade. It resurfaced in small, unexpected ways, in the hesitation of a patrol officer deciding whether to search a home, in the guarded expression of a merchant who had once testified and now wondered whether he had spoken too boldly, in the cautious glances exchanged between people who had learned that beneath manners and civility, undiscovered loyalties might lurk. That lingering tension became part of Louisiana's emotional landscape, an undercurrent shaping decisions quietly, often wordlessly, yet powerfully enough that even those who rejected the story felt its presence. The attic, though empty now, remained a symbol of what could and could not be hidden. When Madame Celestini died years later, her passing did not draw large crowds or dramatic public displays. Those who came to her funeral were a mix of old acquaintances, neighbors who remembered her before the scandal, and a small number of individuals whose faces city officials did not recognize. They stood together in a modest corner of the cemetery, listening as prayers were spoken over her, and when the final handful of earth fell onto her coffin, the air held a quiet reverence that seemed disproportionate to the size of the gathering, but entirely fitting for the life she had led. Some believed she had defied the law, others believed she had been the victim of it, but all acknowledged, with a kind of subdued understanding, that she had possessed a depth of conviction rare in any age. And as they dispersed, several among them wondered not aloud, but in the privacy of their thoughts, whether the boys whose lives had once been tied to hers had ever learned of her death, or if they even remembered her at all. Yet the essence of her story did not end in the cemetery. It drifted into the quiet corners of Louisiana memory, resurfacing in letters, in retellings among families who had preserved fragments of the past, and in historical accounts written long after slavery formally ended. Scholars debated her innocence. Archivists hunted for records that might settle the question, and oral historians gathered recollections that revealed not clarity, but complexity. Over time, her narrative transformed into something more nuanced than heroic legend or cautionary tale. It became an exploration of human responsibility under oppressive systems, a testament to the moral choices individuals made, choices that could not overturn an entire institution, but could shift, if only slightly, the humanity available to those trapped within it. In that sense, the attic was no longer merely a physical space, but a representation of every hidden act of defiance, every secret gesture of protection, every quiet refusal to accept cruelty as inevitable. And so the story of the Louisiana matron accused of hiding fugitive boys in her attic settled into history not as a case defined by guilt or innocence, but as a meditation on the complexities of courage and the price of conscience in a society built upon unfreedom. Her legacy endured in the lives changed by her presence, in the whispers carried along the Mississippi, in the generations who inherited the unresolved tension between silence and action. The attic remained empty, the house eventually sold, the case forgotten by some and reinterpreted by others. But the moral resonance of what had happened, or what had almost happened, continued to shape the memory of an era that struggled to reconcile its ideals with its realities. In the end, her story stood as a quiet but enduring reminder that history is not only written by those who wielded power, but also by those who risked, in whatever way they could, to shelter even a fraction of the freedom denied to others.